If you two never expected to use the names Cher and the Velvet Underground in the same sentence, boy, have you come to the right place, because neither did I until a Far Out magazine from the vaults, I think they call this series piece from back in the day, was put out and kind of came to my attention as I was poking around looking at things on my phone, and I saw this headline called Cher's Scathing Review of the Velvet Underground. So the Velvet Underground, it's hilarious. They were doing this series of shows at an LA nightclub called The Trip from May 3rd to May 18th of 1966. Then they apparently immediately went on to Detroit and did a few shows there where, if I recall correctly, the Yardbirds, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck, I believe, both saw them in Detroit, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But Cher's in the audience, right? Okay, and the Byrds apparently are also there in addition to Ryan O'Neal, the actor. Now the Byrds, so David Crosby would have been there, Chris Hillman, Roger McGowan, Gene Clark, right? So there are some heavy hitters of American pop culture in the moment that they were defining it there at this nightclub. And of course, talk about people defining American pop culture. The Velvet Underground are there, Sterling Morrison, Lou Reed, John Cale, Nico, Maureen Tucker, right? So there is this collection of some of the most fascinating figures that American culture has ever produced, all assembled under the same roof, right, this night. And the Velvet Underground, by May 1966, they had no records out yet. There were delays with the release of their infinitely famous debut record, The Velvet Underground and Nico, which didn't come out till March of 1967. So, almost a year after its creation, which means that Cher would have been hearing some of the most, influential as a word doesn't even describe the impact of the music that Cher would have been hearing that night, which we'll go over. And the Byrds. We got to come back to David Crosby, and we will, because it's very important. It's not just Cher who failed to hear what was happening in the room that night at the Trip. It was also, perhaps even more profoundly and stubbornly, David Crosby. But Cher is there listening to this, right? She's there with Sonny Bono. And she, according to this Far Out magazine story, which of course I'll link to in the description, this happens. The story says, the singer reportedly left early, stating, quote, "The Velvet Underground won't replace anything except maybe suicide." Okay, so, woo, Cher was really enjoying herself at this particular Velvet Underground show. Now, Cher and Sonny Bono, and so we got to think about the time frame here in which she said this and did this. It's 1966, so Cher and Sonny already had put out I Got You Babe, one of the most beloved pop singles of the 60s, and the 60s were a decade loaded with beloved pop singles, okay? It's my favorite decade of music, bar none. So 1965, she already had that up. The next year, they were going to put out in 1967, I Got You Babe, another one of the most beloved pop singles of the decade. But the thing is, they are these syrupy, chirping, golden pop ditties that totally ignore the very existence of the underbelly that Lou Reed made his stomping grounds as a songwriter. Now, Lou probably got a little more credit for writing these Velvet Underground songs than he was owed. Sterling Morrison said later in his life that they just kind of placated Lou, who needed a lot of placating because he was a very grumbly guy all his life, by saying, okay, fine, Lou, you can have soul songwriting credit. But Sterling said, I had a hand in writing things like Femme Fatale and Venus and Furs and Sunday Morning and these songs. And he probably did. Sterling probably was being he was a very genuine, authentic guy who did not spend the rest of his life lusting after fame and fortune. He was a tugboat captain for throughout the 80s in Houston before he ended up in a musical hero in Austin later in his life. But, so Cher, like a lot of people at the time, wouldn't have had much capacity to even fathom what the Velvet Underground were doing because they were so ahead of their time. Mark Deming, he talked about this song Heroin that Cher almost undoubtedly would have, the set list surely would have included Heroin, because it's on their first record. So, if, contrast this clash between Cher and Sonny's stuff, I Got You, Babe, and later The Beat Goes On, with all these songs about scoring drug deals on the streets of Harlem, guys looking for their next heroin fix on the streets, BDSM and the topics that, like in Venus and Furs and all these utterly unabashed explorations of the dark, deep underbelly of New York City as Lou Reed knew it at that time that he was coming up. And Mark Deming, one of my favorite music critics, says this important thing about Heroin that might help us now here in 2023 understand how avant-garde, how against the grain Velvet Underground were in that moment in 1966. He said, while Heroin hardly endorses drug use, it doesn't clearly condemn it either, which made it all the more troubling in the eyes of many listeners. Okay? So, the thing that nonetheless makes it so hilarious that people in that crowd, we have the benefit of hindsight, right? So it's very easy to say this in 2023, but no less amusing and entertaining to think about those reactions to the Velvet Underground's music at that time. Because now what do we know? Now we know that I could sit here and read a list of probably hundreds of bands that had some direct influence by the Velvet Underground. But let's not go with the hundreds of bands. Let's just talk about merely some of the songs that Cher, and again, importantly, David Crosby, would have been hearing that night at the Trip in Los Angeles. Okay? Because I'm waiting, Sunday Morning, the first track of the Velvet Underground and Nico 1967, a record I'm sure, I hope you've heard, and if not, stop the video now and just go listen to them, okay? Because it's such an important record. But Sunday Morning, who covered, think about the bands, this is how you measure a band's legacy in part, is how many important later artists covered songs that first appeared on some other band's original record. In fact, that's a topic for a great video, isn't it? Albums that didn't sell well when they first came out, but had an incalculable influence in the decades that followed. And if I made such a video, which I may someday soon, dare I say that the Velvet Underground and Nika would be number one on that list? I don't think I'd have to make a very strenuous argument in that regard. But if, in fact, we agree that that is part of the measure of a band's importance and legacy, then let us look, shall we, at the bands who, in the decades after, Cher abruptly up and left early from a Velvet Underground show at the Trip in Los Angeles in May of 1966. We now know that Sunday Morning, the first track on that album, was covered by Nick Cave, Matthew Sweet, Belle and Sebastian, Beck, Susanna Hoff, Billy Bragg, and Fish, among many others. And that's just the first track. Okay? I'm Waiting for the Man. Who covered that one? Well, David Bowie, the Stooges, the Yardbirds. Now, this is interesting because David Bowie and the Yardbirds were covering I'm Waiting for the Man before it was officially released. That is how impactful this music was. That when it struck the ears of David Bowie and in the Yardbirds, later Led Zeppelin famous guitarist Jimmy Page, later incalculably famous and influential guitarist Jeff Beck, who spent much of his life doing his own thing and not latching on to a specific band. They argued with each other about which of them was the first to cover a Velvet Underground song. Jimmy Page insisted that it was them, it was the Yardbirds. And he wanted a sole credit for having made the decision to get the Yardbirds to cover a Velvet Underground song. They were both, the Yardbirds in its various incarnations with Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck and David Bowie covering that song in 1966. Okay? Venus and Furs, Dave Navarro, the Smashing Pumpkins, Andrew Bird, again, Beck. All covered Venus and Furs later on. Now, Beck is interesting because he did this record club project in June of 2009 whereby he would, in a single day, cover a whole famous albums. And one of the albums he covered in whole as part of that project was this very record, The Velvet Underground and Nico, the debut album by the Velvet Underground, from which they probably played every song at this club, The Trip in LA, in May of 1966. He also did Songs of Leonard Cohen, which came out in 1967. He did Or by Skip Spence, 1969. Now, Skip Spence was the drummer for the Jefferson Airplane. Skip Spence was a multi-instrumentalist for Moby Grape. These are two... Jefferson Airplane is on the Mount Rushmore of psychedelic rock. Moby Grape didn't quite get as big, but they were wonderful. They've got a great... record out with songs like Sitting by the Window and Hey Grandma. Check that stuff out. But Skip Spence very sadly ended up kind of going down the Peter Green and Syd Barrett path of basically kind of frying himself on acid and was largely aimless and driftless for the rest of his life. But that record he put out before then, or a must listen, must hear. And Beck covered that album in full. Kick by In Excess, and then randomly enough, Yanni Live at the Acropolis was one of the bands that Beck covered in full here. So Beck covered every single song on this debut album by Velvet Underground because he recorded the whole record in a day, right? Femme Fatale, Aloe Black has covered that song. Big Star, Beck again, of course, Duran Duran, R.E.M., Tom Tom Club, Blondie, covered it in 1975. Run, Run, Run. Another, and this is, by the way, the sequence of tracks as they appear in the this is one bulletproof song after another in succession. Run, 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 covered by Kurt Weill, Julian Casablancas of the Strokes. And of course, Beck again. All Tomorrow's Parties, beautiful new wave cover by Japan, right? You've heard that. That's been out for 40 years. But also Jeff Buckley, Nick Cave, Simple Minds, Hole, covered All Tomorrow's Party, St. Vincent, Susie and the Banshees, Brian Ferry, Iron and Wine. They won't replace anything except maybe Suicide. And perhaps, all these other bands might have some passing interest in the music that Cher was hearing that night. Heroin, one of the most famous of Velvet Underground songs. Listen to the range of artists who cover that. You've got blown out, tripped out Rocky Erickson. You don't know who Rocky Erickson is. That's okay, because I'm going to tell you in a video I'm working on devoted exclusively to Rocky's story. The most fascinating figure to emerge from the psychedelic rock scene. He was one of the innovators, one of the inventors of the genre. We'll hear much more about Rocky from me, but Billy Idol on the other end, Rocky Erickson with the 13th Floor Elevators was covered doing songs like I'll Miss You in 1967. Billy Idol in 1993 on Cyberpunk, a panned, critically loathed record, covered Heroin. Splicing it with the Jesus Died for Somebody's Sins But Not Mine line from Patti Smith's Gloria. But Billy Idol to Rocky Erickson, listen to the gamut of artists who were attracted to Heroin. Echo and the Bunnymen, Mazzy Star, Third Eye Blind covered Heroin. Okay, I could go on and on. Every single song on this debut record by the Velvet Underground was covered by a score of also impactful artists and bands, such as those I just named. But in fairness to Cher, it was hard to hear the genius before her. And David Crosby, as we'll see, went on for the rest of his life refusing to acknowledge the genius of that stuff, okay? I don't know how Cher later in her life felt about the music. Maybe she never warmed up to them either. I'm not sure. I'm just being honest with you. I don't know if after May 1966 her opinion of them changed. One would hope it did, especially after Lou Reed broke out with his solo stuff, like in 1972 with the David Bowie produced Transformers, and comes out with Walk on the Wild Side and Perfect Day. Cher knew her stuff as an interpreter of songs, right? She knew a great song when she heard it, and then I'm sure she heard the great songs that Lou Reed came out with later with records like The Bells and Street Hassle and that stuff. But in the moment, it was hard. It was hard to acknowledge what the Velvet Underground were contributing to American pop culture in that moment, because it so thoroughly and abrasively challenged expectations at the time. Brian Eno says this interesting thing on that note in a 1982 interview with Musician Magazine. He said, I was talking to Lou Reed the other day, and he said that the first Velvet Underground record sold 30,000 copies in the first 5 years. 30,000 copies in 5 years. This record that went on to, again, limitless influence hardly anyone picked up a copy at the time that it was released. And more to the point, this debut record, The Velvet Underground and Nico, when it came out, upon its release, it charted at 171. Okay, 171 was its charting position upon its release. Now that's not much, but here's more. That was as high as any Velvet Underground record charted upon its release ever. Any of the handful of records they put out before Lou Reed left in 1970. So it hardly was only Cher who couldn't hear and fathom what the Velvet Underground were up to. But their influence was the point. And that influence was going to take time to become apparent, right? Influence takes time to measure. And this is how Brian Eno measured it. And separately, he said, according to a piece on allmusic.com, my favorite music site, about the Velvet Underground, Brian Eno once said that even though hardly anyone bought the Velvet's record at the time they appeared, almost everyone who did formed their own bands. Brian Eno once said that even though hardly anyone bought the Velvet's record at the time they appeared, almost everyone who did formed their own bands. Now, that's a mic drop point to make about this band's influence, but let's go further. David Bowie, in a 1996 interview, talking about the Velvet Underground's influence as compared to that of the Beatles, said this, talking of the Beatles here in this 1996 interview that I'll link to in the description. Very little of the Beatles' influence is actually felt now. Whew. That's a mouthful, but David Bowie brings a lot of street cred to these assertions, okay? He goes on, it was the fringe, strange bands that nobody ever bought, like the Velvet Underground, that actually have created modern music. Bands of that moment in which, in 1996, David Bowie was giving this interview. He said, bands then were much more into Waiting for the Man than they were into Penny Lane. Much more into Waiting for the Man than they were into Penny Lane. However many critics, this is David Bowie talking again, were saying how important the Beatles were. There are artists saying, yeah, they're okay, but have you heard the Velvet Underground, the band that Cher up and left early that night and said they're not going to replace anything but suicide? And then you think about Mark Deming's praise for Lou Reed. Just isolate him in the brilliant lineup with John Cale and Maureen Tucker, who herself went on to wonderful solo stuff, and Sterling Morrison and Nico, right? But just take Lou Reed in isolation, and here's how Mark Deming put it in the first sentence of his review of a collection called Words and Music, May 1965, that just came out in September of last year. It's outtakes that Laurie Anderson, Lou's widow, brilliant, of course, artist in her own right, stumbled upon and then got released as a collection. Mark Deming said this, just as much as Bob Dylan, Lou Reed changed how rock songs were written when he emerged as an artist in the mid-1960s. But see, that comes with a caveat, because work that groundbreaking, work that cutting edge is going to polarize the audiences that are exposed to it. So we can laugh about Cher having this really dramatic, negative, bristling reaction to what she was hearing, but listen, most people felt that way, as evidenced by their record sales, right? Again, it's funny to look back on, but it's very understandable too, because these songs, largely of Lou Reed's creation, Lou Reed, whose parents subjected him to electroshock therapy when he was a child after they moved from Brooklyn to Long Island. He wasn't fitting in. There were bullies hassling him. Lou Reed was really having a hard time. But can you imagine that today? I mean, this was Lou Reed's childhood experience from which these songs were born, okay? But David Crosby, it's time for us to slap him around a little bit, because David Crosby would have, again, the Byrds were there too, with Cher at the same show, okay? And David Crosby of the Byrds at the time, 1966. Now, David Crosby, wonderful music. Everybody Has Been Burned, the David Crosby track for the Byrds, is probably my favorite Byrds song, and one of my favorite songs of all time. I might, if I were put on the spot and said, what are your top 10 favorite songs? Well, Famous Blue Raincoat by Leonard Cohen will probably be number one, but Everybody's Been Burned. David Crosby wrote that for the Byrds. And I love everything he did with CSNY and solo later on in his life, in the years before his death on January 18th of this year. We lost him at age 81. But there's this hilarious moment in, I think it was 2017, where David Crosby was very accessible. I exchanged tweets with David Crosby. I asked David Crosby one day on Twitter, what'd you think of Warren Zevon? He wrote back and he praised Warren Zevon. See, he was a wonderful, sweet, albeit a bit strange of a man, and a good songwriter and all that stuff. So I got some niceties out of David Crosby, but those were rare. David Crosby was quite the bitter curmudgeon who made these sweepingly generalized condemnations of monumentally important bands towards the end of his life. And the Velvet Underground came up this one day, July 26, 2017. He goes on a rampage on Twitter. It's all because someone asks him, are you a fan of punk rock at any level, David Crosby? To which Crosby responds with one unpunctuated word, no. Yeah, that was it. And people like, what? So another guy comes in and says, I'm surprised. I honestly thought the anti-authority aspect of punk rock would appeal to you. Sure, this is the man, after all, who wrote Almost Cut My Hair, Almost Let My Freak Flag Fly, right? One of the signal protest anthems of his moment. A song that he himself later condemned as dumb and childish. So David Crosby didn't reserve his spitting condemnations for his own work, much to the consternation of his bandmates Stills, Nash, and Young. Also, crapped on his own work with CSNY, but and there's the very word that David Crosby used in response to this. But I thought you would like the anti-authority aspect of punk. David Crosby responds, "Crappy music, though." And then people keep hacking away at him on this day. One guy says, Descendants, Hot Water Music, Talking Heads, New York Dolls, Heartbreakers, Johnny Thunder's band, Ramones, Clash, Buzzcocks, Stooges, damn. David Crosby goes, pretty much all dumb stuff, no musical value at all, mostly childish lyrics. And then the Velvet Underground comes up. Someone else says, Buzzcocks, Fugazi, The Jam, Minutemen, Replacements, The Stranglers, Ex-Devo, The Pogues, Gang of Four, Velvet Underground. Crosby goes, nope, none of those. So it wasn't just Cher. And while Cher's attitude toward the Velvet Underground may have warmed up over time, David Crosby makes clear there that his certainly did not. And it goes to show that contemporary opinions of work that is released in the moment often get it so wrong, or often overlook the genius in their midst. There's a great video that Rick Beato does, talking about some boomer unknown singer-songwriter who wrote something dismissive about Paul Simon in reference to Bob Dylan and the Beatles, and basically said that Paul Simon would, 200 years from now, be known as nothing but a footnote to Dylan and the Beatles, while others like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young would fade into irrelevance, along with Paul Simon. Well, that got Rick's blood boiling, and he posts this wonderful rant where he talks in part about Bach, and he says, okay, let's go back 200 years, which at the time Rick made his video, 2021, would have been 1821. And he says, in 2021, if I said to you the most recorded artist in history would be Johann Sebastian Bach, you'd be like, who? The only people who knew Bach were people like Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and their teachers, because they all played the well-tempered clavier. But did anyone really know who Bach was in 1821? No. And then, poignantly, Rick makes this point. And this is how it happens, guys. This is how a brilliant band could be playing before equally brilliant audience members. I mean, the Byrds, Cher, Sonny, these are brilliant people, brilliant artists in their own right, brilliant musicians, right? They're sitting there and they can't hear it. And what Rick says about that is this, quote, there are people who are alive now who will be talked about from the 20th century that you have never heard of. I guarantee you, he says. There are people alive. There are people who I know even, he says, that I believe 200 years from now, people will be talking about whose music is unknown right now. So certainly Cher, and maybe to a lesser extent, given how stubborn he was about it, David Crosby can be forgiven for not having heard the genius in their midst, because that's what genius does. Again, it challenges expectations. It will confront you. There's a confrontational nature to true genius, that Cher absolutely experienced, and apparently David Crosby too. That one May night in 1966 at a short-lived club called The Trip in Los Angeles. That's what genius does, right? You know, it's Dylan plugging in at Newport while Pete Seeger flails out backstage and threatens to use an axe to cut the cables on the amps, right? That's what the reaction that genius can provoke. Genius is just as likely to provoke praise as it is likely to provoke condemnation. And if it doesn't, one wonders if it truly is genius. Genius will alienate as well as find kindred spirits, okay? You know, that Newport story about Dylan is interesting. You know, it was Howlin' Wolf, my man right here, was playing electric instruments days before Dylan did so at that very Newport Folk Festival. You don't hear as much about that for some reason. But Dylan goes electric at Newport, and it's seen as this, you know. Pete Seeger used to say that in interviews. He said, I saw Howlin' Wolf. I didn't have a problem with the fact that he was going electric. I had a problem with the fact that it sounded like garbage. The amp sucked. The sound system couldn't support that. But he also said, look, Howlin' Wolf, I saw him play electric instruments days before Dylan did at that same Newport Folk Festival. I didn't have a problem with that. My man Howlin' Wolf did that before Dylan at Newport, all right? But I think that's the lesson here. It's not to just, you know, laugh at, Cher was so clueless. That's not the point, and David Crosby, too. The point is, isn't this the perfect example of how easy it is to dismiss, overlook, or ignore genius when it's staring you right in the face, as it literally did that night at the Trip with Cher and the Byrds. You know, so listen, if you're an artist who's got 12 followers on Spotify right now, don't let that deter you. Okay? Keep going, man. Keep going. You never know. You might not be around. Bach wasn't around to know that he would go on to become the most recorded artist in history, and one assumes he would be deeply flattered to know that. But he never did. And sometimes, guys, those are the breaks. You know, that's how it goes. But check out the story. It's a fun read. It's fun to think about. I'll link to Rick's video too. There's several other links here I'll put in the description of things that I mentioned here in this video. Go check it out for yourself, though. It's just a really fun thing to contemplate and think about this weekend.